But again, thank you everybody for joining our webinar today, Manage Metadata 101, Taxonomies and Tagging in SharePoint 2010. This is designed as kind of a tutorial on how to use the term store, how to use the Manage Metadata features, how to use taxonomies inside of SharePoint 2010 to really improve the findability of your documents. So as a good place to get started, we just did a first poll question. What stage is your SharePoint 2010 project at? And I'm going to share the results. And you can see that most of you have already rolled out and are using SharePoint 2010 now. A few are just in the planning phases or in the deployment phases. It's interesting, this is a dramatic shift over when we started doing these webinars probably 15 months ago. At that time, most people were deciding between SharePoint or investigating, and very few had rolled out. And so this poll shows that SharePoint 2010 adoption has really progressed quite a bit. And we see that with a lot of the industry research that we see. And I think I'm back. I apologize for that. We had my phone connection dropped. But let's continue. So to introduce myself, my name is Mark Blair. I'm the COO here at WAND. And I have about 10 years of experience in the taxonomy and tagging space. So I've built a lot of taxonomies, helped customers deploy them, done customizations, et cetera, and done a lot of work in the SharePoint space. A little bit about WAND is first of all, we've been building taxonomy since 1983, so for the greater part of the last 3 decades through a legacy company and as a standalone company since 1998. And our business is providing off-the-shelf foundation taxonomies covering a wide variety of industry vertical domains as well as operational subjects to help people get a jump start with their taxonomy projects. You can see some of the domains from products and services to skills to the general business taxonomy, which I think everybody on the webinar should have downloaded already. On top of our off-the-shelf taxonomies, we do have a great professional services team to help customize taxonomies to make them specific for your business. And finally, we have a piece of software called DataFacet, which is an automatic tagging engine. And that basically provides a means for tagging documents with taxonomy metadata and in an automated and scalable fashion so that your end users don't have to worry about doing it. Brief look at some of the taxonomies available from WAND. Again, cover a lot of industry vertical segments as well as the operational topics. So if you're in oil and gas, if you're in mining, if you're in the financial sector, et cetera, we have a taxonomy for you. At the same time, if you're doing project management or you have a HR department or records retention, something most companies are going to have, we have a taxonomy for those types of topics as well. So our agenda today, first of all, I want to go through why use manage metadata in SharePoint to begin with. Why is it important? We'll review what a taxonomy is and what tagging means. Then we'll take a look at a live demo of the term store in SharePoint 2010 and go through some of the mechanics of how to manage taxonomies, how to build taxonomies. We'll show you how once you've built a taxonomy, they can be used to tag documents. I'll briefly walk through the benefits of search, the benefits of tagging to search and findability, and then we'll wrap up with how to get started in your organization. I'll note in the GoToWebinar panel on your right, there is a questions panel where you can type in questions. So please feel free to do that throughout the webinar. I'll be addressing questions at the end, and any that I don't get to, I put together a frequently asked questions document and distribute that as kind of a take behind. So any question you have will get answered. Just throw it into the screen, and I'll try to address it at the end or in that document. So to start off, we made that general business taxonomy download available in conjunction with Microsoft about 15 months ago. And we have had about 6,000 downloads of that taxonomy to date. And talked to a lot of the folks, and some of the things that we hear again and again are kind of up here on the screen, the common challenges that people are having. And first is that search is difficult in SharePoint. And I say SharePoint, but that could be any ECM system. It might be a shared drive with a lot of nested folders. The bottom line is people have trouble finding their documents. And there's a lot of reason for that. But a big one is they don't have appropriate metadata associated with the documents. So it's hard for people to find what they're actually looking for. The second challenge is that the term store is a very valuable feature that Microsoft introduced, I think, to help it begin to address the lack of metadata. But a lot of companies don't have a taxonomy or term set. So people are wondering, how do I get started? I don't have a taxonomist in-house. We haven't done this before. So what's the first step? Third is people really want to move away from those messy folder structures. I mentioned shared drives, but it happens in SharePoint as well. People start out with the best of intentions. I'm going to create these folder structures. They're going to make a lot of sense, and I'll put my documents in them. But 6 months later, the folder structure is not quite as neat anymore, and maybe that person leaves, and a new person comes in, and they have no idea what that person was trying to do with the folder structure. So people want to get away from folders. They're not really working in the way they should. And last, users don't really want to tag documents. You can make it a required field, but they're still going to do a lousy job. Users aren't really trained to tag documents appropriately with metadata. So it's not a core competency, and it can be a major roadblock to a successful taxonomy project. So those are a few challenges we're seeing. Now, what are some of the folks, kind of the thought leaders in the industry seeing? And Gartner recently put out a piece of research called the ECM maturity model, where they break companies into 5 different levels based on their approach to content management. Is it kind of immature or is it transformative? If you see the screenshot from this document, or from the report, you can see as we move up the graph towards level 5, you see things like extensive meta tagging of content. Enterprise emphasizes content standards. If you look at the report itself, it talks about level 4. Company has taxonomies in place, and automatic tagging is part of the end user's expectations at this point. So to really do a good job at managing enterprise content, according to Gartner, taxonomies and tagging are critical pieces. So I've used the word tagging quite a bit already, so it's probably a good time to go ahead and define it. Tagging simply means applying metadata to documents. And when I say metadata, there's really 2 types of metadata that I think of. The first is flag metadata, and that's going to be things like author, date, file type. Is it a Word document or is it Excel? Kind of the types of things that if you open up the property of any given Word document, you would see already populated. And that's because the computer populates it for you. And that's really helpful, but it's not that helpful for knowing what the document is actually about. So the metadata we're actually going to be talking about today, I call subject metadata. And that's one or multiple words about the content of the document. So is this a contract? Is it a W-9 form? Is it about drilling? Whatever it might be, this metadata is going to give you a hint about what's in the document. And it's these subject metadata tags, they're going to drive search refinements for end users in SharePoint 2010. So now if I do a keyword search, I'm going to be able to see the subject metadata on the left-hand side and narrow my result set based on those tags. So we covered taxonomy, or we covered tagging. Now the other word I've been using a lot is taxonomy. What do we actually mean by taxonomies? And hopefully you've all had a chance to look at that general business taxonomy a little bit to get an idea. But very simple, taxonomy is just a collection of concepts around a given subject domain that have been organized into a hierarchical tree structure. So if you look to the right, you see an example of our manufacturing taxonomy. And you see some topics that you would expect a manufacturing company might have: computer-aided planning process, master production plan, routings, etc. And you can see that it's organized into a logical way so that somebody would know that machine allocation, of course, would be underneath manufacturing planning, and they would know where to look for that. So that's kind of what a taxonomy is. It's basically a set of potential metadata values that can be tagged to documents inside of SharePoint. And the reason it's valuable is it's going to help you put some context and structure around all this unstructured information to help people find it more effectively. The basic elements of a taxonomy in SharePoint that you really need to understand, there's not too many of them. They keep it pretty simple, which is nice. The first is just a preferred term. That's actually the term itself, or the category, or the metadata. In this case, foreign exchange. Foreign exchange has a broader term of asset types. This is from our finance and investment taxonomy. And a more specific type of foreign exchange is Australian dollar. And a synonym, or another way to say foreign exchange, would be foreign currencies. So these are really the main elements that you need to understand to be able to edit a taxonomy in the term store, which we'll take a look at in just a few minutes. So we know what a taxonomy is. Now, taxonomies cover a lot of different areas. Enterprise taxonomies are really a data model for the unstructured text within your organization. So a lot of people we talk to have done business intelligence and data warehousing in the past, and they're familiar with the idea of a data model for all that quantitative, highly structured information. And taxonomy is just the very same thing for this unstructured information. And another way to think of it is it's a representation of how the enterprise organizes information. How do topics fit together? What terms are important? It's a common language for the organization so that documents can be labeled, people can find information, and information is actually being communicated. So to kind of summarize this set of slides before we look at the demo, why taxonomies for SharePoint 2010? Again, documents just don't have the appropriate metadata now, and that's a major barrier to findability. Big driver for that, it hasn't been well supported in earlier versions of SharePoint. End users generally aren't going to be tagging documents as they create them. Shared drives are pretty messy, and those certainly aren't tagged. As a result, there's a great dissatisfaction with search overall. Keyword search just isn't doing the job. It's bringing back too much information, and users need a way to filter that information to find what they're actually looking for, improve the relevance. Next is kind of also enhances the social capabilities of SharePoint 2010. We'll touch on this very briefly today, but if you're using the My Sites or the My Profiles capability in SharePoint 2010 or any of the social features, taxonomy can be very important. I like to say, if we're going to be social, we need to be speaking the same language. And again, that's what taxonomy is providing, a common language for the organization. And then last, if you have multilingual needs, if you have an office location in another country in another language, taxonomy can be a powerful way to support different languages. You can translate the taxonomy and have a common metadata model across all your languages. So one thing I like to point out now is as you're thinking about your taxonomy project, a lot of companies make the mistake of thinking we need one enterprise taxonomy. I need my WAND taxonomy or my XYZ corporation taxonomy. And that's a big job. How do you create one taxonomy that reflects your entire business? The way I like to approach it is to think of it a little bit differently. In SharePoint, it supports the idea of multiple term sets or multiple taxonomies. In SharePoint, a term set is the same as a taxonomy. So I might need a taxonomy of product names that I can create. And I may need a taxonomy of geography. It could be office locations or my main customer markets. I may want a taxonomy of materials that I use, that I'm going to tag design documents with. I might want a taxonomy of human resources that I'm going to use to tag my intranet type documents. So the long and the short of it is you don't need just one taxonomy. You really want to think what types of documents or what types of content are being deployed into SharePoint, who are the users of this type of this content, and how do those users want to be able to search for their documents. And that's going to drive what term sets do I need to assign to each library. So the human resources people may want to search based on human resource document type and geography. And the engineering people may want to use the materials taxonomy and the product name taxonomy because that's kind of their focus, that's their pivot points. So instead of thinking of it as one giant taxonomy, you can break it into bite-sized chunks and use the smaller term sets. The next question people often ask is what types of things belong in a taxonomy to begin with? And I kind of break it into two different areas. There's things or topics. You might think of them as kind of nouns. It might be currencies or your product list or locations. And then your more verbs, processes or functions or business areas. So opening an account might be a process that a bank might have. Or processing a claim would be something an insurance company might do, and those would be good things to have in the taxonomy. So with that, I'm going to open up our second poll question. And that question is, does your company have any taxonomies? And if so, have they been deployed to SharePoint 2010? So take a moment to answer that, and when we come back to the presentation, we will be looking at how to manage taxonomies inside of SharePoint 2010. And again, while you're answering, I'll emphasize that feel free to enter questions into the panel on the right. We'll go over those to the Q&A, or you'll get an answer at the end, or in the follow-up document that I sent. Okay, we've got about 75% of you have voted, so we'll go ahead and close it and share the result. And we can see that 35% of you don't have any taxonomies at all, and that's fairly common. Don't feel like you're behind, and the fact you're at the webinar today is a great start. About 55% of you are just starting to build out taxonomies, and 10% of you have taxonomies, but they're not yet in SharePoint 2010, and nobody on the call has deployed them in SharePoint 2010 quite yet. And again, just like the first poll, that's a slight progression over what we saw a year ago, but we're definitely seeing that people are still just coming to taxonomies and becoming familiar with them. So how do we actually use what are the mechanics of managing taxonomies inside of SharePoint 2010? And here we have a SharePoint 2010 instance set up, and the feature that allows for taxonomies to be used in SharePoint is called the Manage Metadata service. And the interface, the user interface for the Manage Metadata service is the term store. So the term store is where we want to go to edit our taxonomies. The term store can be accessed through central administration, but we can also just access it through site settings. So that's what I'm going to do. That's important to know because you don't have to have central admin access in order to manage taxonomies, just from a governance standpoint. So the term store is going to be under Site Administration and Term Store Management. And that's going to take me to my term store. And I'm going to just review some of the basic functionality and kind of give you a lay of the land of the term store. The way it's set up is on the left-hand side, you're going to see your taxonomies. And on the right-hand side, you're going to see some administrative options depending on where you're at on the left-hand side. So the taxonomies are organized into containers called term groups, and term groups are associated with a managed metadata service. So that's what we see at the top level. We're clicking on the managed metadata service. And if you look at the right, there's a few options associated with it. Number one to note, you can actually have multiple managed metadata services, but that's fairly uncommon. I don't usually see that, but just something to know. At the managed metadata service level, you're going to set up who your term store administrators are. And these people are going to be the ones who are going to be able to actually create groups and assign people to the groups, which we'll get to in just a moment. And then the other important thing is you can decide what languages are you going to use. What's your primary language, and then what working languages or translations are you going to support. So you would just select those, and then those are going to be valid for all your taxonomies or term groups. Now the term groups are the next level down. Term groups are basically set up for, this is where you're going to manage who's able to make changes to certain taxonomies. So the purpose of creating a term group might be, I have 3 taxonomies related to engineering, and I have an engineering business user who I want to manage those taxonomies. So I'm going to create a term group. I'm going to put those taxonomies in that term group, and I'm going to set that person up as a group manager. And then I may have another set of taxonomies that are more on the operational side that I'm going to have someone from human resources manage, whatever it might be, and set up the term group that way. So term groups are the only way you can set up permissions as far as who can actually make changes to a term set in the term store. As we go farther down inside of a term group, now we're actually looking at taxonomies or term sets. So this is these are a few of the term sets that I just have in a SharePoint Saturday demo term group. And if I click on one, just the geography one, you're going to see on the right another set of kind of administrative options to choose from. First, what's the term set name? A brief description for the term set that you may want to use to provide context of why we're using this term set or why we created it. Owner, contact, and stakeholders. Again, just to reemphasize, these are not permissions, but more sort of administrative, who's the primary user or group of the term set, who's a contact person if an end user wants to suggest a change that should be contacted, and who are the stakeholders of this term set. So if you decide you're going to make a major change to the term set, you may want to, you'll see that these are the stakeholders, and you can reach out to them to discuss the change. Again, that's all going to fold back into kind of your governance plan. The last 2 pieces are, one, the submission policy. And the submission policy is basically saying, is the term set open or is it closed? If the term set is open, that means that an end user who's doing tagging in SharePoint would actually be able to come in and make a change to the taxonomy from outside of the term store. If it's closed, that wouldn't be allowed, and the end user would have to submit a request for a new term or whatever it might be. For us, a best practice is to keep your term sets closed. The reason for that is that your end users aren't going to be trained in taxonomies. They're not going to be familiar with, they may not be totally familiar with the goals of the taxonomy or the governance strategy around the taxonomy. So if you let them make changes, what you'll begin to see is some misspellings. You'll see duplicate terms. You'll see different variations of the same terms, and it can kind of get out of control. So we really suggest keeping it closed and then putting some other methods in the governance plan to get feedback from the end user. And then the last is it available for tagging or not? And this is generally, once the taxonomy is ready for prime time and you're ready to push it out to your users, you're going to want to check this so that they can then see the taxonomy and tag with it. Underneath the term set, we're at last beginning to see some actual taxonomy terms. And now we're looking at some potential metadata values. Asia Pacific, Europe, North America. These are all things that users would be able to tag documents with. You can see it's organized again into the hierarchical structure. So we have Atlanta as a city underneath North America. But as I click through, I'll go to Twin Cities. We can begin to see another set of options just at the term level itself. So first option, is it available for tagging or not? This is maybe turned on for some terms and maybe turned off for some terms. The terms that you probably wouldn't want to make available for tagging is the case where it's sort of a mid-level term. It's useful for organizing terms underneath it, but it's not a very useful tag. An example might be if you had a term geography with cities underneath. Geography is not a very helpful tag, but it's helpful to organize the cities. So you turn it off for tagging purposes. And then if an end user tried to tag something to geography, they wouldn't be able to. They'd be sort of pushed down into the lower levels where they'd see the specific city names. So if it's not turned on for tagging, users will be able to see it, but they won't be able to assign it to a document or any other element. Next is, what is the language that you want to edit? The primary language is English, but if we wanted to add a Japanese translation or Spanish, that's how we would do it. The description of the term, that's just going to be a brief definition of what this term means. An end user is going to see it if they are mousing over the metadata in SharePoint. It'll give them a brief description. The default label is just the name of the term itself. Pretty self-explanatory. It's the primary term that you're going to use for this concept. And then other labels is what SharePoint calls synonyms. And I think Twin Cities, probably some good synonyms might be Minneapolis and St. Paul, because if an end user tries to tag to Minneapolis, we want to direct them to the concept we're using is Twin Cities. So I'm going to save those. But it's pretty easy to add those synonyms. So those are the administrative options that are available to you in the term store at each of these levels. And then the way you can actually edit the taxonomy is pretty straightforward. You're going to go back over to this left-hand panel and simply right-click on a term. And I can create a new term, say Charlotte. I can copy a term, so I could take this term and move it to another term set. I could copy the entire branch, and again, use it in a different term set. I could reuse a term. Reusing a term is like copying it, only it's going to kind of link the two terms together. They're going to share a unique identifier in the database, so it's still the same term, it's just appearing in more than one place. I can merge terms together. That basically is saying I'm going to take these two terms, combine them into one, and one term will become my default label, and the other will become a synonym. Deprecate a term. What that means is it might be a term we've used in the past for historical purposes, but we're not going to use it in the future. We don't want to delete it, so we're going to deprecate it, or basically turn it off for historical purposes. People will be able to see it, but you would never be able to tag a new document with it. Moving a term, pretty self-explanatory. And deleting a term, also fairly self-explanatory. We recommend using deprecating a term instead of deleting a term. The reason for that is that you can maintain it for historical purposes. So you can delete a term, but only do that when you're doing kind of that initial taxonomy editing. So that's kind of how we're going to manage taxonomies inside the term store. The last thing that is worth mentioning and that you should be aware of in the term store is down here kind of below this dashed line in this system term group. And in the systems term group, we're going to see a term set called keywords. And I just got to note that some users are not seeing my screen. And I apologize for that. You guys should now be seeing my screen. To help remedy this, I'm embarrassed, I will send the recording of the last webinar. So the content up to this point is going to be very similar. You'll see, you'll be able to see the slides that we were looking at. So I do apologize for that. So if we look here, again, now you can see the term store and some of the things we're looking at. This is going to be we'll briefly review. This is going to be the managed metadata level. This is going to be the term groups, and then underneath the term set, and then the terms themselves with the administrative options on the right. So here's, to briefly go back, we're going to have the Twin Cities, and you can see where the synonyms have been added as other labels. So to kind of continue on, this term group that is worthwhile looking at here on the left is called keywords. Or it's in the system term group and the keywords term set. What keywords are is they're keywords or key phrases that end users have typed into SharePoint in some of the free-form keyword fields that may have been available to them. One example is going to be tag the notes over on the right. If I click on this, I can free-form tag a document or a page on SharePoint. But all that terminology is going to show up inside this keywords term set. And this is really valuable for an ongoing governance because I can always come here and review and see the types of keywords that users have added. And it may be that it's a new term or a new acronym that I wasn't familiar with that I can then use to improve my term sets above or my main taxonomies. So maybe electronic arts, I say, oh, that should be in my customer taxonomy. So I can right-click and I could move it and move it up to one of the primary term sets above. So that's a way from an ongoing improvement standpoint you can take advantage of what end users are typing in and giving them a little bit of flexibility to tag with what they want while still keeping control of your main taxonomies. So to summarize up here, these are what are called managed terms, and these are what SharePoint calls managed keywords. So the two can work hand in hand to combine the best of a sort of a top-down approach and a bottom-up approach. So that's how you're going to use the term store. Now, once we have actually created our taxonomies, the next step is how do I take those taxonomies and deploy them to documents? Now, what we'll see here is I'm going to open up just a sample library. And we're going to see a set of documents. And with the documents, we have a few columns set up already with locations and document content that are populated with some of the term sets that we had created. So if I actually go to one of these documents and edit the properties, I'll give this a chance to load. I'm going to see some of these fields set up. Here's the location with Twin Cities. And I can actually click and see the taxonomy that's set up. So how do we set up these columns? What I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to my Library tab up here underneath Library Tools, and I'm going to click on Create Column. We'll just call it Test Webinar Column or whatever name you would want to give it. But once you create a column, you're going to decide, you need to decide what values go into that column. What's a valid value for that metadata column? And you can see there's a lot of options, but the ones we're interested in is Manage Metadata. So I've clicked on Manage Metadata, and we're going to allow multiple values. And now if I go down here, you're going to see that I can choose from the, it's going to connect to the term store, and I can see my term groups and begin to choose from the term sets that I'm most interested in. So I'm going to populate it with this SharePoint Saturday organizational taxonomy and save this column. And now you can see I have a brand new column. And now for an end user, if they come in and they check in a document, the system will actually prompt them it's going to bring up the properties field, and then the user can populate each of the columns with the appropriate piece of metadata. There's two ways that they can do tagging when this pops up. In these columns below, I can either use the type ahead capability. So I'm going to type in Minneapolis, and you can see how the synonyms appear. Minneapolis, which we added as a synonym to Twin Cities, shows up in parentheses. But if I click on it, it's going to tag to Twin Cities. Or I can click on this tabs icon and choose a value that way. And here's the new column we set up, and you can see it's the only values I'm able to populate with this column are from this SharePoint Saturday organizational taxonomy. So that's how the taxonomies get from the term store and find their way into libraries where the end users are going to use them to tag and organize information. And now as an end user, I have a few different options for being able to use this to help filter through. I can go up here at the top and filter based on location. So here if I want to say, just show me everything in North America. You can see nothing was tagged to North America, so what I need to do is include the descendants. And now I have all the cities, for all the documents that have a city in North America. The other thing you can do is here on the left-hand side, I've enabled a SharePoint web part that's out of the box. It's called the Metadata Navigation web part, and you just turn it on for a library in the library settings. But it's going to actually let me filter through the taxonomy here. And I can click on Kansas City. And now I have the two documents that I'm actually looking for related to Kansas City. So that's a way that taxonomy is helping your end users find documents more effectively, even outside of a keyword search, just using browsing through a library. And again, the big benefit is all around findability. So we've shown how you can create taxonomies and how you can manually tag. What I want to show now is give a little look at some of the foundation taxonomies from WAN very briefly and what those kind of look like, and then show how instead of doing manual tagging, you can do more of an automatic tagging approach, again, to remove the burden of doing the tagging from an end user. So this is our DataFacet Automatic Tagging Engine that WAN provides. It's a native SharePoint 2010 application that installs. It's tightly integrated with the term store. So all the term sets that we saw over here, you're actually going to see here in the term store, or inside of DataFacet. And just as an example, I'll open up our project management taxonomy. And as you look at this, you can kind of begin to imagine how something like this can really give you a jump start instead of starting from scratch. It may not be 100% perfect out of the box, but it's not designed to be. It's designed to get you this terminology that you can then use and extend with the terminology that's specific to your organization. So this project management taxonomy has about 250 terms and all the types of documents that would be important if you're managing a project. You'd have a change request log, you'd have expense reports, you'd have a business case, you'd have deliverables, feasibility studies, et cetera, et cetera. Again, all of these are good pieces of subject metadata that can be used to tag documents. When you start with a foundation taxonomy, you can, again, add terms, subtract terms, take branches, and create new term sets if you want to. There's a lot of flexibility, but it's really giving you a jump forward. From a tagging standpoint, I'm going to open up our general business taxonomy. And the way DataFacet works is it's a rules-based tagging engine. What that means is that each term in the taxonomy has a rule associated with it. And when a document is checked in to SharePoint, and it can tag other SharePoint content as well, I should mention list items, calendar items, blogs, etc. But whenever that content is added, DataFacet is going to run all the rules against that piece of content by looking at the text of the document or the content. And if a rule is true for that piece of content, then it will be tagged with that piece of metadata. If it's false, it won't. Now, from a rule standpoint, rules can be created using any sort of Boolean operators as well as regular expressions. And I've come into DataFacet, and you can see my left-hand panel gives me the taxonomy. And on the right is where I'm going to actually create the rules. So I've selected contracts, and the default rule is just the term contracts or agreements. So it's saying if it sees either of those concepts in the document, then it should tag to contracts. So I don't know if that's a good rule or not, but DataFacet gives me the chance to test the rule. And what that's going to do is it's going to run the rule in real time against all my documents. And it gives me a representative, it's returning the set of documents that actually, if we were to tag with this rule, would be tagged as contracts. And I can click on them and say, and get a text version down below with some highlighting so I can see exactly why this document tagged as a contract. But I'm the administrator, and I say this really does not look like a contract to me. And I'm looking at the title, and I know we don't have any contracts with the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company. So I'm just going to create an exclude rule and retest the rule to see if that improved things for me. And it did narrow it down, but I'm still not seeing things that are contracts. So maybe I'm going to scrap this rule. And instead of trying to exclude things, I want to think of what types of terms do I see inside of what I would think of as a contract. And one that's in a lot of contracts is force majeure. So let's see if that makes for a better rule. And you can see now we're just down to 2 documents. So maybe this is too restrictive, but if we look at these actual documents, these in fact are contracts. So that kind of gives you a brief look at how you would go through the process of trying to create rules and improve them so that when DataFacet is doing the automatic tagging, it's tagging the types of documents you want with the types of terms that you want. Now, once we've created our rules, for the end user, their experience is going to be a little bit different than what we saw before, where I had to manually tag the document. I'm going to just go into this library and check in a document. And this time, when I check in the document, instead of having to manually tag it, what DataFacet is going to do, again, is it's going to index the content of the document. It's going to run the rules against the document. And this is just a insurance enrollment form we use at WAND. It's a PDF. And again, those rules that are valid for the document are going to be tagged. Those that aren't won't. And in this case, from our general business taxonomy, we see it's tagged with short-term disability and long-term disability. So again, instead of, as an end user, my work is done. I can simply save the document. It has the appropriate metadata, and I can move on with my day, instead of taking the time to open this up, browse through the taxonomy, find the terms I want. So it's providing a scalable and consistent way to tag your documents. And then again, all this metadata is going to be enabled for the end user in their search experience. They'll be able to search for a document, and then on the left-hand side, filter based upon the taxonomy terms. And let's show you what that looks like. So this is just a SharePoint enterprise search, which is what we see is the search engine most folks are using out of the box, and then they're evaluating migrations to FAST down the road. It's characteristic. Some people are starting with FAST, but just going to do a search for the term Pepsi, and we have a lot of taxonomies loaded in. But you can see it's 910 search results, which is quite a bit. But with the DataFacet tool, we have a web part that gives you a hierarchical view of the taxonomy. So I can actually filter through the taxonomy and narrow the results based upon the taxonomy term set. So we did sports drinks, and now we're seeing things like workouts, energy drinks. So we've narrowed the result set just from Pepsi to Pepsi, but those documents that are tagged as sports drinks. It's a more specific result set. And that's what you're wanting to provide to the end user. That's the real benefit, is that improvement in the findability. And with that, we'll return to our PowerPoint slides. And do a little wrap up before the Q&A. So now that we've looked at some of the tools that are available, how do you actually get started with deploying taxonomies and helping get your users better findability? And there's really 3 steps you need to think about. One is build your taxonomies. Develop a tagging plan is 2. And number 3 is the ongoing governance. So plan for growth and improvement in the taxonomy and tagging over time. So a few things for building your term sets. One is the business users really should be involved. They're not necessarily going to be the ones building the taxonomy. We're not recommending that. But we do recommend talk to the stakeholders. Understand how do they want to search for information. How do they think of the organization? What terms are important to them? What documents are they using on a day-to-day basis? And that's going to help you understand what term sets do we need to create to help support those documents. A good best practice, if possible, you can start with the CSV import format for SharePoint. You can download that from your SharePoint instance, or the general business taxonomy we provided is in that same format. But this is nice because when you're doing initial editing of the taxonomy and you want to solicit feedback from people, it's kind of nice to have a spreadsheet you can pass around and make notes on. And then once you've got most of your major changes in, then you can import it into the term store and make any changes from that point forward in the term store. A lot of people have the question, do we start from scratch? How do we get started? So a few things to think about. If you're going to build a taxonomy from scratch, you do want to have some taxonomy expertise to avoid some of the common pitfalls. It can take a lot of time to start from scratch. A lot of companies will take the approach of putting an internal team resource or a committee together with the idea of that committee will create our taxonomy. And what we see is that process can take 6, 9, 12 months, sometimes longer. With some of the consultants we've talked to express that frustration. And all the while, the core project, the idea of getting documents in and tagging them, is being delayed. So we recommend if you can start with a foundation taxonomy. And WAND obviously provides foundation taxonomies, and we'd be delighted to work with you. But even if you don't work with WAND, try to find something to get started with. Maybe it's an industry standard that's available to you. Maybe it's a file plan you have that can be edited. Maybe it's a process manual that can be turned into a taxonomy from the index. But something that gets you that initial 75, 80% of the way there and gives everybody a common sense starting point. So when you're talking to the business users, they can see what a taxonomy is, and they can sort of visualize how they're going to be able to use the taxonomy to find documents more effectively. It's like an Amazon search. You do a keyword search, and on the left-hand side, these taxonomy terms are going to appear, and you'll be able to drill down in the search results based on those terms. So figure out how you're going to get started with the taxonomy. Then once you have a taxonomy, what's your tagging strategy? Are you going to use manual tagging? Are you going to use some sort of default tagging in SharePoint? You can set up document sets, and if a full file goes into this document set, it will inherit that metadata. Or use default values based on the location of where the file is placed. Those are options for getting metadata in, but they won't be particularly specific. So everything in that folder will share the same metadata. And then the last option is an automatic tagging approach. The WAND has a solution. There's other solutions available as well. But if you want to get really specific metadata for each document that you put in, your options really are manual tagging or automatic tagging. And here's how we sort of compare the two. With manual tagging, your challenge is, I kind of think of them as the 3 C's. You have compliance. Can you get people to actually do the tagging? Consistency is one person going to tag the same way as another person? It particularly becomes an issue in large organizations. And then correctness. Are people actually tagging documents with the right values, or are they just trying to get through this checkbox and move on? With automatic tagging, we see the big benefits. One is speed, scalability, flexibility, meaning I can always go back and re-tag documents. I can edit my taxonomy and re-tag. I always have the ability to change and make improvements and adjust rules. So I'm never really stuck. Whereas with manual tagging, once a document is tagged, it's pretty unlikely that someone's going to go back to look at that document again in 6 months when you've added a new branch to the taxonomy. So having something automated in place gives you a lot of that flexibility to make ongoing improvements. And then I think the last two are really the big ones. One, the users doesn't have to tag, so they're not going to be resistant to the taxonomy project. It's not additional work for them. And they see the benefits right away. With a manual tagging approach, it might be 6 or 9 months before you have enough documents tagged where there's a critical mass in the search that they're seeing the results and they're seeing the ability to do the filtering. With an automatic approach, they can see robustly tagged documents on day one. It can always be improved, but they have the ability to use those tags to improve their findability. Then the last, just ongoing governance. So if you're doing a SharePoint project, you likely have a SharePoint governance plan. Make sure that taxonomy management is included in that governance. Review your enterprise keywords regularly. Make sure you're taking advantage of that resource. Create some policies and standards for when are we actually going to create a new term? When do we deprecate a term? What are our definitions going to be used for? How are we actually going to name our terms in a consistent fashion? Are we going to capitalize? Are we going to use and, or are we going to use ampersand? Those sorts of little decisions can make a big impact, because if the taxonomy looks consistent, then the end user is going to have confidence in it. So with that, we're going to do one last poll question, and then while you're answering the poll question, I'll kind of review some of this Q&A, and we'll answer some of those questions to close up. But the poll question: what is your biggest concern about managed metadata in SharePoint 2010? And we'll close it up. I'll share the results. And these are also pretty characteristic of other webinars we've done. Some of you are concerned about the right taxonomies, some are concerned about tagging, but most of you are concerned about all of the above, and that's a good thing. They're all important issues. There's no right answer on this one. You really need to make sure that you have a mix of how are we going to tag, what are we going to tag with, and then how do we maintain it going forward. So now we'll take a look at a few questions. I appreciate everybody's time. I do want to note, if you see on the icon, we will be exhibiting at the SharePoint conference in Las Vegas next month. And so if any of you will be attending, we'd love to have you drop by our booth and say hello. But let's address some of the Q&A. First question, can you make some columns mandatory? So that question, I think, maybe speaks to maybe a manual tagging approach. And the answer to that is yes. When you create a metadata column in SharePoint, you can make it a required field so that the user has to fill it in before they leave. And if you're doing manual tagging, that's probably a good approach to make sure that these values get populated. The downside of that is users still have the chance to be lazy, and they may tag with just the top terms in the taxonomy, or they may get used to tagging to a few terms that they like. And so we still have the consistency and correctness problem, but you can enforce the compliance by making that required. Next question, how do you package and deploy the foundation taxonomies that you deliver? So the taxonomies we deliver are provided in the same format that general business taxonomy was. It's in the SharePoint 2010 import format. And all you do is you just right-click on a group name in the term store, and it gives you the chance to import a term set. And then you just go find that file, select it, and then it'll import the taxonomy right in. Next question. Does the automatic tagging allow you to search for specific values in existing fields to locate content to tag? So the answer for that is yes. You can create a rule and limit it to just the title of the document, or any official metadata fields that have been pulled into SharePoint can be used to create rules. So if you wanted to tag a documents based on date range, for example, you could create a range rule and point it to the date field of the document. Next question, this is a good one. Do changes via manual tagging override what may have been auto-tagged by the rules? So when you automatically tag a document, the end user does have the option to make adjustments to those tags. They could remove tags, or they could add new ones. Now, it's not a trivial task to keep track of what's been added or removed at each of the document level. So this needs to be part of your governance plan if you're using the tagging. But when the user makes the change, they can make the changes if they want. But then if you ever want to go back and retag, there's two types of retagging that can take place. One is a complete retag, where it's just basically going to wipe out that field and replace it with new values based on whatever the latest version of the rules are. So that would overwrite any changes the user had made. The second is an incremental tag, where you can retag documents, and it's not going to delete anything. It's only going to add new tags. The thing you have to be aware of there is that it is possible if a user has removed a tag, that then that tag gets reapplied. So that just needs to be part of the governance when you're using automatic tagging. And we're a little over the hour. I'll answer a couple more questions, but there has been a lot, so I really appreciate it. And those that I am not able to answer, again, all the answers to the questions will be provided in the follow-up materials, as well as a recording of this webinar and the last webinar is a special bonus, and please accept my apologies for not having my screen shared for the first bit of the webinar. So last question, I'm going to talk about document sets with inheritance. How does this work? And that was one of the tagging options that I'd mentioned. The way it works is in SharePoint 2010, for the first time, they introduced the concept of document sets. And document sets are basically like folders. But the big difference is you can set metadata at the document set level. So you might, if it was at SharePoint, you might set a document set with the Twin Cities and schedule as the metadata values. And then every document that gets placed into that document set is going to have those two metadata values, Twin Cities and schedule. So it's a good way to make sure that all your documents get metadata, but it's not going to be specific to each document. It's going to be kind of general to the whole document set. So from a search and navigation standpoint, if I were to filter by Twin Cities, I would just see everything in that document set. So I think that we'll wrap it up. Appreciate everybody's time today. I hope it was a valuable webinar. And as you leave, there will be a brief survey, and we'd love it if you'd complete it. And if anyone's interested in seeing a more in-depth demo of any of our taxonomies or our automatic tagging engine, we're happy to set that up. But appreciate everybody's time. Appreciate the patience with our technical difficulties, and look forward to hopefully seeing some of you in Las Vegas next month.